Courageous Hearts. This is a story about love, courage, and the power of family bonds. It tells the tale of Emma, a brave young girl who faces numerous challenges and finds true love amidst the storms. Let's dive into Emma's world and explore her journey of love and resilience. Love amidst the storms. I woke up feeling happy and smiling. Today is Thursday, which means the whole family will gather at my grandfather's house, and the party will last until the morning. My cousin, Ryan, will also come. I got out of bed with excitement, took a warm shower, and put on a delicate dress. Then, I went downstairs. They hadn't arrived yet, so I went into the kitchen to help my mom and my aunts prepare breakfast before everyone arrived. My cousin, Sarah, came in, and as soon as I saw her, I frowned and said, "What's up, Sarah? You're wearing an evening dress and full makeup. Are you going to a wedding?" "We're just staying at home." My aunt, Sarah's mother, spoke up and said, "What's it to you? Let the girl do what she wants. If you're jealous, do the same, darling." I looked at her in astonishment and sarcasm and said, "Very jealous, really? I have no idea how to do the same." She got annoyed with me, but before she could respond, my mom intervened and said, "It's none of our business what Sarah does. The important thing is that you get the plates ready because they've arrived." I smiled and took the plates. When I approached Ryan, who was sitting and chatting with everyone, he smiled at me and said, "How are you, Emma?" My smile widened, and my heart raced as I replied, "I'm fine, thank you. How are you?" He answered with the same smile and said, "I'm good now that I see you." I felt shy and looked at the rest of the family with embarrassment, then quickly went back to the kitchen. My grandfather whispered in Ryan's ear, "You embarrassed the girl, be more gentle." Ryan smiled and said to my grandfather, "I was just being honest, Grandpa." My grandfather smiled warmly at Ryan because he was almost his favorite grandchild. We all left the kitchen and sat around the table to have breakfast. I was sitting next to my mom, directly facing Ryan, while Sarah sat beside him. She handed him the bread with a coquettish smile and said, "Here, Ryan, you need to eat well." I looked at her in amazement and anger, but Ryan's response was enough to make me happy when he said, "Why do I need to eat well? Am I pregnant? Eat, Sarah, please." We all laughed at what he said, and I felt relieved. Ryan left the bread Sarah gave him and took another piece. After we finished eating, I went to the kitchen to make tea. Everyone was sitting in the living room, but Sarah was glued to Ryan, trying to talk to him about her studies. I took the tea cups and served everyone. When I reached Ryan and Sarah, I said angrily while looking at Ryan, "Do you want me to change the tea and bring lemon?" Sarah replied nonchalantly, "Yes, the weather is hot." I looked at her with anger, but Ryan quickly intervened to avoid a fight and said, "Bring the tea. I only like to drink it from your hands on Thursdays." I smiled as I saw Sarah looking at me with sharp eyes, but I didn't care. My cousin, Jack, came and stood beside me, speaking angrily, "Sarah, come here. I need to talk to you." She waved her hand dismissively, saying, "Later." He got more annoyed and said, "Sorry, but we need to get some things for Grandpa." Sarah sighed in exasperation and got up, saying, "All right, let's go." They all left, and Sarah sat down next to Ryan on the couch. Ryan leaned his head slightly towards me and said, "I missed you." I looked at him in shock, and he smiled, saying, I missed your tea. You make it differently." I tried to hide my blush and said angrily, "Well, Sarah can make it too, and it'll taste different." He frowned and said to please me, "No way, no matter how much sugar she adds, it will always taste bland." I laughed at what he said and quickly remembered something. I said happily, "Hey, guess what? My friend Chloe, who I told you about, is getting married in 2 days." He spoke with surprise. "Didn't you tell me she broke up?" I looked at him, thinking for a moment, then said, "No, that was my other friend, Nadia. But Chloe is the one you always see with me. She's my closest friend." He nodded thoughtfully and said, "I don't remember her well, but congratulations to her. May you be next." I looked at him with disgust and said, "May I be next? May you be next too." He smiled and said, "God willing." I looked at him angrily, feeling like I wanted to pull his hair out. Meanwhile, Jack and Sarah were walking back to the house after getting the supplies. Jack spoke hesitantly, saying, "Sarah, I want to ask you something." She replied indifferently, "Ask." He took a deep breath, thinking about how to phrase the question, and after a 2-minute pause, he said, "Do you love someone?" She looked at him in confusion and said, "Why are you asking?" He stammered, "I just want to know as your cousin and because I care about you." She looked ahead and said, "Don't worry, I'm not talking to anyone." He remained silent, not knowing what else to say. He always had the feeling that Sarah was interested in Ryan more than necessary, and that hurt him. He always felt like her heart was attached to Ryan, while he, who loved her, was invisible to her. They entered the house, and I was sitting next to my grandfather, showing him a video and laughing. Suddenly, my grandfather said to me, "Do you know Ryan wants to get engaged?" I looked at him in shock and said, "What?" He smiled and said, "Why didn't he tell you? You're the closest one to him." I looked ahead angrily and sadly, trying to hide it so my grandfather wouldn't notice. After a minute, I got up from my grandfather's side and sat on the couch next to Ryan. I said angrily, "Why didn't you tell me?" He was focused on his phone, and when he heard me, he looked at me in confusion and said, "Tell you what?" I closed my eyes and took a deep breath to calm down, then said, "Don't pretend you don't understand." He looked at me strangely and said, "Are you feverish? I really don't understand." I glared at him and said, "So, you're not planning on doing anything soon?" He looked ahead thoughtfully and said, "No." I looked at him angrily and left. My grandfather had been watching us, smiling. I returned and sat next to him, and he asked, "Do you love him?" I looked at him quickly in shock and said nervously, while smiling to hide my discomfort, "Who do I love, Grandpa?" He looked at me after squinting his eyes slightly and said, "Don't pretend, I can see the cat and mouse games you two play. I'm just waiting for the right time." I felt embarrassed and looked down, saying, "Grandpa, there's nothing like that. He's just my cousin." He looked ahead and said calmly, "All right, if that's the case, let him get engaged as he wishes." I looked at him with sadness again, but remained silent. I glanced at Ryan with anger and fiery eyes, while he looked at me with confusion. He was about to come over to me and my grandfather to find out what we were talking about when Sarah came and sat beside him, laughing. I looked at them both with intense eyes. Sarah spoke to Ryan, saying, "Hey, Ryan, want to play a game?" He replied with boredom after picking up his phone, "No, I've outgrown games." She spoke with persistence, "But this isn't a kid's game. We can play dominoes or cards." He looked at her with the same boredom and said, "They're still games. I don't want to play." She was about to say something, but I interrupted her with disgust, "I'll play with you, sweetie." She looked at me with disgust and said, "No, I don't want to play anymore. I smiled at her provocatively. She then said, "Okay, Ryan, how about we go get ice cream and take a walk?" I looked at Ryan with fiery eyes, and he smiled provocatively, saying, "I'll think about it." I spoke quickly without realizing, "What do you mean you'll think about it?" I closed my eyes as soon as I realized what I said, and Ryan smiled. But Sarah clung to the word and said with a smile, "Okay, let's go." I looked at her and said, "He said he'll think about it, not that he's going." She replied, "What's it to you? Come on, Ryan, let's go." I glared at him with anger, and before he could reply, Jack spoke loudly with hesitation, "Everyone, since we're all gathered here, I want to say something." We all paid attention to him, and he started sweating from nervousness and hesitation. After 2 minutes, he said with a smile and looking at Sarah, "I want to ask for Sarah's hand in marriage." Sarah replied angrily, "Who are?" Sarah was about to say something when Jack continued loudly, "I want to ask for Sarah's hand in marriage." Sarah replied angrily, "Who do you think you are to ask for my hand? Are you out of your mind?" Jack looked at her with sadness and shock, and our grandfather stood up with a stern expression, saying, "Sarah, learn some manners and don't respond to your cousin that way." Sarah responded angrily, "Didn't you hear what he said, Grandpa? He must be out of his mind." Our grandfather spoke firmly, "Watch your tongue, Sarah. Apologize to your cousin." He then turned to Sarah's father, Uncle Mark, and continued, "Look after your daughter, Mark." Uncle Mark got up and took Sarah by the arm, saying with mild anger, "It's not appropriate to reject someone in such a rude manner, Sarah." Jack looked down with a broken heart and said, "It's my fault for bringing this up suddenly without preparing anyone. The mistake is mine." He then left the house quickly and dejectedly. Ryan got up and followed him. I spoke to my grandfather, trying to comfort him, "Don't upset yourself, Grandpa. Her parents will talk to her. Just take care of your health." My grandfather took a deep breath and said, "Did you see how Jack's face turned pale when Sarah spoke to him so harshly?" I looked down with regret and said with a smile to lighten the mood, "Don't worry, Grandpa. I'll make you a lemon drink to calm your nerves, and we can chat as usual." He smiled, knowing I was trying to cheer him up, and I went to the kitchen to make the drink. Meanwhile, Ryan found Jack sitting alone at the end of the street, lost in thought and sadness. Ryan put his hand on Jack's shoulder sympathetically and said, "Don't worry, she's the one missing out." Jack looked at Ryan with anger and said, "What do you have that I don't, Ryan? Why does she love you and not me?" Ryan looked at him in surprise and said, "There's nothing special about me, Jack. Besides, she doesn't love me. It's just teenage feelings, and they will pass." Jack removed Ryan's hand from his shoulder aggressively and said, "It's not clear, Ryan. It would be better if you didn't talk to me. It will make it easier for me not to see you." Jack left, and Ryan returned to the house. The entire family was tense because of what had just happened. Everyone except me and my grandfather went to their homes, including my parents. Ryan and his family stayed the night at my grandmother's house. I asked Ryan, "What did you do?" He smiled and said, "He's just a bit affected by what happened and getting some fresh air." I smiled back but remembered that Ryan wanted to get engaged, so I frowned again. Then I said excitedly, "I'll make us some milk tea, and we can stay up and listen to Grandpa's stories." They encouraged me, and I made the tea and returned. My grandfather began to tell us stories with a smile while Abdel Halim Hafez's song played in the background. After the story, I got up to go to bed, but Ryan stopped me and said with a smile, "Aren't you going to say goodnight like every Thursday?" I looked at him with disgust and said, "Ask your fiancé to say it." He looked at me in confusion as I walked away, leaving him puzzled. The next week passed peacefully. Jack barely stayed at home, only coming to sleep, and Sarah didn't seem to care about what she had done. The family gathered again at my grandfather's house, and it was 3 in the afternoon. We were all sitting together after breakfast, except for Jack, who hadn't arrived yet. Ryan sat beside me and said with annoyance, "I saw the photos you posted on your friend's wedding day. What were you wearing?" I looked at him in surprise and said, "A dress." Ryan continued with fake seriousness, "I thought it was something else." Then he shifted to a more serious tone and added, "Didn't it seem a bit tight?" I suppressed a smile and pretended to be upset, saying, "No, it wasn't tight. It was fine, and Dad and Grandpa saw it and didn't object." He looked at me with annoyance but stayed quiet for a moment before saying, "All right, Emma, you'll understand everything tonight." I looked at him with confusion and curiosity but decided not to engage in any more conversations with him until the time came. We spent the rest of the day normally until the evening. Ryan went to sit beside my grandfather, who gathered us all and said with a smile to my father, "Ryan has asked for Emma's hand, Saber." I looked at them in shock, unable to process what was happening. I didn't know whether to be happy or to hide. My father smiled after looking at me and said, "If the bride agrees, I have no objections." Everyone looked at me to know my opinion, and I was still in shock. Then I looked at the ground and said, "Whatever you see fit, Grandpa." My grandfather smiled and said, "What if we refuse? Will you refuse too?" I quickly replied, "Why would you refuse?" I realized what I had said out of haste and embarrassment and stayed silent, looking at the ground. Everyone laughed and moved on, discussing when the engagement would be and when we would go shopping for the gold. We decided that the engagement would be simple and quiet at home. Everyone was very happy with the news, except for Sarah, who was shocked and left the gathering as soon as she heard my grandfather's words. Honestly, I didn't care about her feelings because she had been causing too much trouble. My anger towards her increased after what she did to Jack and her lack of remorse. Ryan tried to talk to me throughout the day, but I ignored him as much as possible because I was embarrassed, especially after learning that he wanted to get engaged to me and not someone else. The happiness inside me was overwhelming. The love that I had kept to myself all these years had not gone to waste. We were now engaged. Sarah didn't attend the engagement party and stayed upstairs, but Jack was there. After the simple party, we sat down to eat cake, feeling happy. Ryan sat beside me and leaned in a bit, saying with a smile, "Congratulations on me." I smiled and said, "No, congratulations to you on me, not the other way around." He smiled and said, "All right, I'll take it. But honestly, I'm lucky to have you." I smiled, feeling shy, and stayed quiet. He leaned in again and asked, "Will you say goodnight to me before I leave? You're now my fiancé." I looked at him in surprise and said, "You still remember?" He smiled and said, "How could I forget something you said? And soon you'll be in my house, so I can't forget anything you say." He pointed to his head, and I smiled. The happiness inside me was overwhelming. I couldn't believe he was now mine. In a few months, we would be living together. We spent the rest of the day in peace and joy, each going to our respective homes. Ryan and his family stayed at my grandmother's house until the next day. The day was filled with calls from Ryan, showing me his playful side until we both fell asleep. A month passed since our engagement, and it was a very peaceful month with no problems. The only change was in Sarah's behavior. She became quiet and depressed, spending most of her time alone. Despite not liking her much, I didn't want to leave her alone and tried to comfort her. But every time I approached her, she pushed me away. I eventually decided to let her be. We were all gathered at my grandfather's house as usual on Thursday when Jack stood up and said with a smile, "I have something to tell you all." We all looked at him with interest, and he continued with joy, "There's a girl I've been thinking about for a few days, and I want to ask for her hand in marriage." We all looked at him with happiness, and my grandfather encouraged him, saying, "What are you waiting for? Get her father's number, and we'll set a date to go." Jack smiled brightly and said, "Really, Grandpa?" My grandfather replied with a smile, "Really? Would I joke about something like this?" Jack ran to hug my grandfather with joy, and we were all happy for him, especially after what happened with Sarah. I saw the shock on Sarah's face, which was surprising because she was the one who rejected him. After that, Jack went to get some things for the house, and Sarah followed him, saying quickly, "Jack, wait." He stopped, surprised, and asked, "Is there something, Sarah?" She hesitated and fidgeted before saying, "Are you really going to ask for another girl's hand?" He replied calmly, "Yes, as you heard." She spoke spontaneously and sadly, "But didn't you love me?" He smiled slightly and said, "I did, Sarah. But now I love someone else, and I'm going to ask for her hand. Hopefully, she won't reject me." Sarah responded quickly, "But you still love me." Jack spoke with irritation, "Why are you so sure, Sarah? Not everything is yours, and opportunities come only once. What's available now won't always be. Excuse me, I have things to do, and this conversation is pointless." He left indifferently, and she sat on the stairs, crying. I followed her, having overheard Jack's last words. I sat beside her, put my hand on her shoulder, and said sympathetically, "God willing, you'll find someone who truly loves you. Don't do this to yourself. Learn how to get yourself out of this situation." She wiped her tears, looked at my hand, then at me with sadness, and said, "How can you still be kind and gentle with me after all the things I've done to you? How can you be so kind and caring to someone who intentionally hurt you?" I looked at her and smiled, saying, "Because I don't want to live in darkness, Sarah. People who let hatred, jealousy, and anger control them live in darkness their whole lives. No one wants to live in darkness. The light of the eyes is precious, and so is the light of the heart. Live your life, Sarah, and wait for someone who truly loves you and whom you truly love. Live your life with happiness, free of hatred and anger, and you'll find the world smiling at you from all directions." As I finished speaking, she hugged me tightly, crying. I held her until she calmed down, then we wiped her tears and went back inside together. Everyone was surprised to see us together, smiling and holding hands, but it pleased them greatly. 2 weeks later, we attended Jack's engagement party. We were all happy, and Sarah seemed more at peace, which made me very happy because I was able to help her before she fell into complete darkness. Ryan sat beside me on the chair and said with a smile, "In 3 months, you'll be my wife." I smiled back and said, "Finally, really? God willing, everything will go smoothly, but I'm genuinely scared something might happen." He looked at me with suspicion and said, "You sly one, is that why you helped Sarah? To avoid problems?" I looked at him in shock and said, "Lower your voice, you rascal. That's not the only reason, you know." He winked at me and said, "But it's one of the reasons." I looked at him and smiled, saying, "All right, fine." Life in our family became very calm. We returned to being a united family with no problems between us. We eagerly awaited every Thursday to gather and spend the night sharing stories and laughing together. And so my story ends. I hope you liked it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to receive all that is new. Have a nice day.